Millionaire Richard Thompson never imagined that when he arrived home early from a business meeting, he would catch his wife, Victoria, forcing Amelia, the cleaning lady's 12-year-old daughter, to scrub the luxury bathroom floor with her bare hands. "People like you need to learn early on where your place is in this house," Victoria shouted. The girl was kneeling on the cold marble, tears streaming silently down her face as she scrubbed at a stain that clearly wasn't there. Her small hands trembled, not from the cold, but from sheer humiliation. Victoria, with her impeccable blonde hair and expensive jewelry, watched the scene with a cruel satisfaction Richard had never witnessed in 15 years of marriage. "And stop whining," she snapped. "Your mother isn't here to defend you. You're going to learn to be useful or you'll be leaving this house with her." Richard stood frozen in the doorway, processing the diabolical scene unfolding before him. Grace, the dedicated housekeeper who had worked for them for 6 years, had gone out to get cleaning supplies. It was the perfect opportunity for Victoria to reveal her true colors to a defenseless child. At 45, Richard had built a real estate empire worth $300 million. He had always prided himself on treating every employee with respect and dignity. Yet here was his wife, a woman who smiled sweetly at charity events and spoke passionately about social equality, psychologically torturing a 12-year-old girl. Richard's voice was low, controlled, but charged with an intensity that made Victoria turn abruptly. "Richard, I didn't hear you come in." A fake smile instantly appeared on her face. "I was just teaching Grace's daughter some responsibility." "You know how it is. If we don't educate them early, they'll never learn." Amelia tried to stand quickly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. But Richard saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of Victoria, but the deep fear children develop when they are constantly humiliated by adults who should protect them. "What kind of responsibilities?" Richard asked, walking slowly toward them. "Oh, you know." Victoria gestured nervously. "Basic cleaning, organization, things useful for her future." Richard bent down to Amelia's height, ignoring his wife completely. "How are you, sweetheart?" The girl glanced at Victoria, clearly calculating whether it was safe to answer. "I'm fine, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. But Richard hadn't become a successful businessman by accident. He could read people. He knew when someone was lying out of fear. Seeing this child trembling before him awakened something inside him. His business enemies would have recognized it instantly, the deadly calm that precedes a devastating storm. For years, Richard had noticed small signs. Grace would sometimes bring Amelia to work, and the girl grew visibly tense when Victoria was nearby. Conversations would stop abruptly when he entered a room, and the way Victoria spoke about educating these people when she thought he wasn't listening, it all made sense now. "Amelia," Richard said gently, "go to the kitchen and get a snack. Your mother will be back soon." As the girl ran off, Richard turned to his wife with an expression she had never seen before. It was the same expression he wore when preparing to destroy a business rival. "We need to talk," he said simply. Victoria didn't yet realize she had crossed a line of no return. She had no idea that Richard had grown up in a poor family, or that his black grandmother had been humiliated by wealthy employers in exactly the same way. Most importantly, she didn't know that this moment of cruelty was about to cost her more than she could ever imagine. That evening, during dinner served by Grace, Richard observed every interaction with the microscopic attention his business rivals feared. Victoria was particularly animated, chatting about a charity event she would be hosting next month to help needy children. Meanwhile, Amelia stayed in the kitchen, avoiding all eye contact. "Honey, you haven't touched the salmon," Victoria said sweetly. "Grace outdid herself today." "I was just thinking about our conversation earlier," Richard replied, cutting into his food without eating. "About raising children?" Victoria laughed, a sound that once had been musical to his ears but now rang false. "Oh, you know how I am. Sometimes I'm too strict, but it's for their own good. These people need to understand boundaries early on. These people," Richard repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "You know what I mean," Victoria said, pouring herself more wine. "If we don't establish a hierarchy, she'll forget her place." Amelia was playing in the living room yesterday and got the suede sofa dirty. I had to be firm. Richard felt a cold shiver down his spine. Firm how? Nothing serious? Victoria waved it off. I just explained that some areas of the house are for the family, not for... Well, you understand. What Richard understood was terrifying. His wife of 15 years had revealed herself to be someone he no longer recognized. Or worse, she had always been this way. And he had been too blind to see it. That night, unable to sleep, Richard went down to his office and turned on his computer. For 2 hours, he revisited memories he had buried decades ago. Her grandmother, Josephine, was a dignified black woman who had worked as a maid for wealthy families her entire life. Richard remembered weekends at her house, listening to stories about cruel mistresses who made her redo perfect work out of pure sadism. "Richard, my boy," she would say, "never forget where you came from. Money can change your situation, but it can't change your heart. And if one day you have power, remember how it feels to be trampled on." Josephine had died when Richard was 16, but her words shaped every ethical decision of his career. Now, at 45, a respected multimillionaire, he realized with horror that he was married to the very kind of person who had once tormented his grandmother. The next morning, Richard decided to work from home. He settled into his office with the door slightly ajar, pretending to be absorbed in spreadsheets while discreetly observing the household dynamics. What he discovered over the next few hours was worse than he had ever imagined. Victoria had developed an elaborate system of psychological cruelty. Whenever Grace went shopping or was busy elsewhere in the house, she would find Amelia and assign her humiliating, impossible tasks. She made the girl reorganize the library alphabetically, then by color, then by size. She made her polish windows that were already spotless. She forced her to sweep the same hallway over and over. "You're too slow." Richard heard Victoria snap when Amelia took too long folding linen napkins. "At your age, I already knew how to work properly." "But you're different, aren't you?" The casual cruelty in her voice made Richard clench his fists under the desk. Victoria wasn't just abusing a child. She was systematically trying to break Amelia's spirit, to make her believe her value as a human being was inferior. At lunch, Victoria casually remarked, "You know, dear, I think we need to talk about Grace and her daughter's boundaries in this house. They're getting too comfortable." "Comfortable? How?" Richard asked, though he already knew he was about to hear more venom disguised as domestic concern. "Amelia has been very bold lately. The other day I caught her looking at books in the library. Expensive books, Richard. And yesterday she asked about your shoes, if they were Italian. That kind of curiosity isn't healthy." Richard nearly choked on his water. "A 12-year-old asked a curious question and that bothers you?" "They're not innocent questions," Victoria insisted. "It's envy. She's starting to wonder why we have nice things and she doesn't. That kind of thinking leads to bigger problems." It was at that moment Richard fully understood the woman he had married. Victoria didn't see Amelia as a curious and intelligent child. She saw her as a threat to the social order she considered natural and desirable. For Victoria, keeping a black girl in her place was a moral imperative. That afternoon, while Victoria was at the spa, Richard had a careful conversation with Grace. What he learned was devastating. For months, Victoria had been systematically humiliating Amelia, always when Grace wasn't around. The girl had begged her mother not to say anything, afraid they would lose their jobs. "Mr. Thompson," Grace said through tears, "I need this job. I have nowhere else to go with Amelia, but I don't know what to do anymore." Richard looked at the woman who had kept his house spotless for 6 years, who was raising an intelligent daughter alone, and who now faced an impossible situation. At that moment, he wasn't just a husband confronting his wife. He was Josephine's grandson, and it was time to honor the promise he had made at her grave. "Grace," he said calmly, "you're not going anywhere." But Victoria doesn't realize she's awakened something she should never have touched. That night, while Victoria cheerfully described her plans for the upcoming charity event, Richard made plans of his own. She thought she knew her husband, successful, confident, but passive when it came to domestic matters. What she didn't know was that Richard Thompson had built his empire by systematically dismantling people who underestimated his capacity for strategic revenge, and for the first time in 15 years of marriage, that ruthless ability would be directed at someone inside his own home. Victoria was about to discover that humiliating the maid's 12-year-old daughter wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was the biggest strategic mistake of her life. The following Monday, Richard canceled all his meetings and did something he hadn't done in years. He spent the entire day at home. Officially, he was working in his office. In reality, he was documenting every move his wife made through a system of cameras he had discreetly installed over the weekend. What he saw in just the first few hours was even more systematic and cruel than he had imagined. Victoria had developed a precise routine of psychological torture. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the moment Grace left for shopping, she would call Amelia and assign impossible tasks. Reorganize the china cabinet by size, then by color, then by shine. Clean mirrors that were already spotless until they were truly clean. Sweep leaves from the garden on a windy morning. "You're taking too long." Victoria would scold in that sweet voice Richard once adored, but now heard only as poison. "At your age, I already knew how to work properly. But you're different, aren't you? You need to learn early where your place is." Richard recorded everything. Every cruel word, every unnecessary humiliation, every calculated attempt to break the spirit of a 12-year-old child who had done nothing wrong but be born into the wrong family. But it was on Tuesday that Richard uncovered something that changed his strategy entirely. While going through old wedding documents, he stumbled upon a box of letters that Victoria had carefully hidden. They were correspondences between her and her friends from a social club, dated 2 years earlier, around the time Grace had first begun bringing Amelia to work during school vacations. "Dear Patricia," one letter began, written in Victoria's elegant handwriting. "You can't imagine how annoying it is to have this little black child running around the house. It's as if she doesn't know her place. Yesterday, I caught her leafing through magazines in the main living room. Expensive magazines, Patricia. I had to be firm and explain that certain things are not for people like her. I'm thinking of suggesting that Grace stop bringing the girl." Richard felt nauseous reading those words. Victoria wasn't abusing Amelia out of impulse or stress, as she had once tried to justify. It was a calculated campaign to put the girl in her place before her natural intelligence became a threat to the social order Victoria considered sacred. That afternoon, while Victoria was at the spa enjoying treatments paid for with the money Richard earned, he made a call to James Mitchell, the most respected private investigator in town, and one of the few black men who had broken through the barriers of the local professional elite. "Richard Thompson," James said when he answered. "I wasn't expecting your call. I hear you're in need of some special services." "How did you know?" Richard asked. "Let's just say news travels fast in certain circles. Grace Williams works for you, doesn't she? Her daughter Amelia goes to the same school as my niece. Bright girl, but lately she's been strangely quiet," Richard realized. James already knew more than he was saying. "I need your help documenting some situations that are happening in my home," Richard said at last. "Situations involving my wife and Grace's daughter." Richard's silence after that was answer enough. "I understand perfectly," James continued. "Coincidentally, I've noticed troubling patterns in certain families of the local elite. Your wife, for example, has been quite active in the preservation of traditional values group on Facebook. Interesting posts about maintaining natural hierarchies and properly educating certain people. Richard had never heard of this group. "What kind of post?" James replied, "Screenshots of conversations where she and other society women discuss methods for disciplining employees who don't know their place. Your wife is particularly eloquent about training children from an early age to accept their social position." Richard's blood ran cold. Victoria wasn't just abusing Amelia. She was sharing her methods of cruelty with other elite women as if it were a social hobby. "James, I need everything you can find on these activities. And I need evidence unquestionable in any court of law." "I've already been working on it for 3 weeks, James said. "Ever since my niece told me Amelia came to school in tears after being forced to apologize to your wife for looking at things she wasn't supposed to." That evening, As Victoria excitedly described her plans for a charity gala to help less fortunate children, Richard watched her every gesture, every inflection, every fake smile. "You know, dear," she said, pouring herself French wine that cost more than Grace's monthly salary. "I think I finally managed to teach Grace's daughter some important lessons. She's been much more respectful lately." "What kind of lessons?" Richard asked casually. "Oh, nothing much," Victoria said lightly. "Just explaining about appropriate boundaries, about respecting property that isn't hers. Children need to understand hierarchies from an early age." "Don't you think?" Richard nodded, pretending to agree, while mentally adding another recorded confession to the growing mountain of evidence. The next morning, James called with a discovery that would change everything. "Richard, you need to see what I found in the records of domestic workers your wife employed before Grace. In the last 10 years, at least 6 families resigned without explanation. I contacted 3 of them, and all had daughters between the ages of 8 and 15. Each reported that their daughters developed psychological problems after a few months of working in your home. One mother said her daughter developed panic attacks whenever she saw blonde women." Richard realized he had uncovered not just an isolated case of cruelty, but a decade-long pattern of systematic abuse. His wife had perfected cruelty into a sadistic art form. "James," Richard said, his voice taking on the icy tone he used to destroy competitors in business, "I want you to document everything. Every post, every message, every testimony. Prepare a complete dossier that leaves no room for interpretation." "It's already being prepared," James assured him. "But Richard, I need to warn you. When this comes to light, it won't just destroy your wife. It will shake the entire social structure of this city. A lot of powerful people are involved in her group." Richard smiled, but it wasn't a smile Victoria would recognize. It was the smile he wore when he was about to completely rewrite the rules of the game. "James, let me tell you something about my grandmother Josephine," he said quietly. "She always told me that when you have real power, you don't use it to protect yourself. You use it to protect those who cannot protect themselves." As he hung up the phone, Richard realized Victoria had awakened not only a betrayed husband, but the grandson of a woman who had endured decades of silent humiliation. Unlike Josephine, he had the resources, influence, and connections to ensure justice would not only be served, but turned into a permanent example. What Victoria didn't know was that her next lesson for Amelia would be documented not just for personal use, but for an audience far wider than she could ever imagine. On Thursday, the night of Victoria's charity gala for needy children, Richard set in motion a plan that would turn the most anticipated event of the year into a public spectacle no one in attendance would ever forget. The grand ballroom of the Metropole Hotel was immaculate, with 300 members of high society in attendance, politicians, business leaders, journalists, and the nation's most influential philanthropists. Victoria circulated radiantly in her $15,000 dress, receiving compliments for her generosity and concern for the welfare of less fortunate children. "Tonight is about giving opportunities to young people who were born into less privileged circumstances," Victoria said from the stage, her melodious voice echoing through the hall. "I believe that every child deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their background." The applause was warm. Flashes went off as she smiled for the cameras, completely oblivious to the fact that Richard was at the head table, watching her every move with the patience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. James Mitchell, elegantly dressed and wearing a press badge, circulated discreetly among the guests, distributing tablets with a presentation that would forever change everyone's perception of the hostess of the evening. At 9:30, just as Victoria took the stage for her keynote speech, Richard calmly rose from his table. "Excuse me," he said into the microphone, interrupting his wife. "Before my dear wife continues talking about dignity and respect for children, I would like to share with everyone some interesting discoveries I've made recently." The silence in the hall was instantaneous. Victoria looked at Richard with an expression of growing confusion, still not fully understanding what was happening. "James," Richard called, and the investigator approached the stage carrying a laptop. Could you show us the videos you documented this week? The first recording appeared on the giant screen behind Victoria. It showed her forcing Amelia to reorganize the china cabinet for the 5th time in a row, shouting, "People like you need to learn from an early age what your place is in this house." A murmur of shock rippled through the audience. Victoria visibly paled, finally understanding the extent of what Richard had discovered. "This is her," Richard continued, his voice echoing through the hall's perfect acoustics, systematically humiliating a 12-year-old girl whose only crime was being born into the wrong family. The second video showed Victoria deliberately knocking over a vase of flowers and forcing Amelia to clean up the shards with her bare hands. The third recording captured her laughing on the phone with a friend, describing how she had made the girl cry. "Richard, stop this," Victoria whispered into the microphone, but her voice was broadcast throughout the hall. "You're taking everything out of context." "Context?" Richard repeated. James Mitchell took the stage and opened a folder full of documents. "Perhaps we should contextualize it with these conversations from the Preservation of Traditional Values Facebook group, where you discuss methods for disciplining employees who don't know their place." Screenshots of Victoria's posts appeared on the screen. Messages where she boasted about putting the maid's little girl in her place and shared humiliation techniques with other society ladies. The audience began to stir. Some guests got up and walked toward the exit, clearly not wanting to be associated with the scandal unfolding live. "We also have," James continued, "testimonies from 6 previous families who worked for the Thompsons. All reported similar patterns of psychological abuse directed specifically at their daughters." Victoria tried to leave the stage, but Richard gently blocked her path. "We're not done yet, dear," he said, his voice now laden with a coldness she had never heard before. "The guests need to know exactly who they are contributing to tonight." The fourth recording was the most devastating. Victoria speaking on the phone with Patricia, her best friend. "You should see how I managed to break that little black girl's spirit. Now she doesn't even look me in the eye. She's finally learned her place." The silence in the hall was absolute now, broken only by the sound of chairs scraping as more people got up to leave. Camera flashes went off frantically, not to capture moments of charity, but to document one of the biggest social scandals of the decade. "Richard." Victoria tried once more, tears beginning to stream down her carefully made-up face. "Can we talk about this at home?" "At home?" Richard laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Victoria, you no longer have a home. The divorce papers were filed this morning. 50% of the assets, as determined by the prenuptial agreement you signed, and apparently never read carefully." James approached the microphone once more. "I would also like to inform you that the State Attorney General's office, after reviewing all the evidence presented, has decided to open a formal investigation for moral harassment and mistreatment of a minor. The documents were delivered this afternoon." Victoria collapsed, her legs giving way as the reality of her situation hit her like an avalanche. It wasn't just a social scandal. It was the complete end of her life as she knew it. "And finally," Richard said, his voice softening slightly, "I would like to introduce everyone to Amelia Williams." The 12-year-old girl stepped onto the stage, no longer in simple clothes, but in an elegant dress and new shoes. By her side, Grace walked with the dignity of someone who could finally hold her head high. "Amelia will start at St. Margaret's Preparatory School next Monday with a full scholarship, funded by the Thompson Foundation," Richard announced. "Grace has been promoted to Domestic Operations Manager of our company, with a salary of $40,000 a year and full benefits." The applause that began timidly turned into a standing ovation, not for Victoria, who remained on the floor of the stage, but for Richard's courage in exposing hypocrisy, and for Grace and Amelia's dignity in the face of months of humiliation. "True charity," Richard concluded, looking directly at the cameras broadcasting live, "is not giving money to appear in photos. It is ensuring that a bright child has the same opportunities as any other, regardless of the color of her skin or her family's bank account." Victoria finally managed to stand up and stagger toward the back exit, but the camera flashes followed her relentlessly, Her social reputation was destroyed, her philanthropic endeavors ruined, her relationships with the local elite permanently damaged. The next day, the story was on the front page of every local newspaper and went viral on social media as a devastating example of racism disguised as charity. Victoria was officially removed from all charitable boards. Her friends stopped answering her calls, and even the luxury beauty salon she frequented canceled her future appointments. Meanwhile, Richard watched Amelia playing in the garden of the house, finally free to be a child without fear of humiliation. But one question still hung over the whole situation. Did Victoria truly understand the moral weight of what she had done? Or was her only concern the social consequences of being exposed? The answer would come in a way that even Richard, with all his careful strategy, could not have predicted. 3 months later, the transformation was complete. Amelia walked the halls of St. Margaret's Preparatory School with the confidence of a child who had finally understood her true worth. Her grades were exemplary, and she had become a student council leader, organizing anti-bullying campaigns that inspired schools across the state. Grace, now operations manager at Thompson Enterprises, oversaw a team of 15 employees and earned more in a single month than she once had in an entire year as a cleaning lady. Richard had discovered that her administrative efficiency was just as impressive as her dedication to her former work. Victoria, on the other hand, was experiencing devastating social isolation. Her former social circles had completely abandoned her. The Preservation of Traditional Values group was shut down after a federal investigation, and 3 of its members were facing charges of racial discrimination. The modest apartment she had managed to rent with her divorce settlement contrasted sharply with the mansion where she had once reigned as a cruel queen. "Mom, can I invite my friend Emma over for dinner on Saturday?" Amelia asked Grace as they organized documents in the company office. "Of course, dear. Our home has always had an open door for your friends." Richard watched the scene from his desk, remembering the words of his grandmother, Josephine. "True power is not humiliating those below you. It is elevating those who deserve to be at the top." The sweetest justice was not seeing Victoria lose everything she valued, but witnessing Amelia discover everything she always deserved to have. A child who once cleaned floors on her knees because of the cruelty of others now debated public policy at student conferences, proving that talent knows no color, social class, or origin. Victoria had tried to destroy the spirit of a 12-year-old girl out of pure prejudice. Instead, she ended up creating one of the most promising young leaders of a new generation. Amelia not only survived cruelty, but she thrived despite it, turning her pain into purpose and her humiliation into strength. True charity, Richard realized, is not donating money to appear in photos. It is recognizing human potential, where others see only prejudice, and ensuring that no child has their future limited by the ignorance of adults who confuse privilege with superiority. If this story of transformation touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove the best revenge against cruelty is to build a world where it finds no place to flourish.